Welcome to various eras in time, where tonight we travel deep into the golden heart of ancient Africa to find a queen so extraordinary, so devastatingly courageous, and so completely forgotten by the world that the mightiest empire in all of human history, the Roman Empire, at the absolute peak of its glory and its power and its breathtaking, world-consuming arrogance, sent its greatest armies against her, lost, and then spent 2,000 years pretending it never happened. She was a warrior who lost everything, her husband, her son, her eye, and kept fighting. She was a mother who buried her child and returned to the battlefield the next morning. And she was a queen who looked the most powerful man alive directly in the face and told him, with the quiet, unshakable certainty of someone who has already decided how the story ends, that her people would never, under any circumstances, belong to anyone but themselves. Her name was Queen Amanirenas, and this is her story. I hope this will help you fall asleep, or you are just simply listening for relaxation. Before we begin, comment below which part of the world you are listening from. Now, let us begin. To truly understand the story of Amanirenas, to feel its full weight and its full wonder and its full extraordinary significance, we must first understand the world she was born into. Not the world as Rome understood it. Not the world as the history books that most of us were handed as children described it. But the world as it actually was, vast and ancient, and breathtakingly alive in ways that the historical record has consistently, almost willfully, failed to fully capture or convey. And that world begins, as so many of the greatest stories in all of human history begin, beside a river. Not just any river, the greatest river in the world, the Nile. The Nile is a river of almost incomprehensible scale and almost incomprehensible antiquity, a 4,000-mile ribbon of life cutting through the heart of the African continent from its sources in the mountains and lakes of equatorial Africa all the way north to the Mediterranean Sea, carrying with it the rich black silt of the African interior and depositing it along its banks in annual floods that have been feeding the civilizations that grew up beside it for longer than recorded history can reach. Most people, when they think of the Nile, think of Egypt, of the pyramids of Giza rising from the desert plateau west of the river, of the temples of Luxor and Karnak reflected in its waters, of Cleopatra and the pharaohs, and the extraordinary civilization that the world has spent centuries studying and celebrating and treating as though it were the only remarkable thing the Nile ever produced. But the Nile does not end in Egypt. It continues south, far south, into a landscape that grows wilder and more ancient and more deeply, quietly extraordinary with every mile. It continues into the land that the ancient Egyptians called Ta-Seti, the land of the bow, the land that modern historians call Nubia, the land that its own people, across the long centuries of their proud and magnificent history, called Kush. And it is here, in this ancient, golden, iron-rich pyramid building, warrior queen producing kingdom sitting in the heart of northeastern Africa, in the land that is today the modern nation of Sudan, that our story begins. Here, where the desert meets the river, and the sky at night is so vast and so brilliantly populated with stars that it feels less like a ceiling and more like a window into something infinite and ancient and completely indifferent to the small, urgent, deeply human dramas unfolding beneath it. This is Kush, and it is one of the most extraordinary civilizations the ancient world ever produced. At the heart of the kingdom of Kush, sitting on the eastern bank of the Nile in the warm red landscape of what is today central Sudan, approximately 200 miles northeast of the modern city of Khartoum, there was a city, not a village, not a settlement, not a collection of modest mud brick buildings clustered around a marketplace and a temple, and calling itself a capital out of a kind of hopeful civic pride. that exceeds its actual dimensions. A city, a real one, magnificent and sprawling and alive with the particular energy of a place that has been accumulating history and wealth and human ambition for so long that those things have become part of its physical fabric, built into its walls and its streets and the very air that moves through it on a warm Nubian afternoon. Its name was Meroe, and in the year 57 BC, the year that concerns us most as we begin this story, it was one of the most remarkable cities on the face of the earth. Picture it in the full warmth of a Nubian afternoon in the middle of the 1st century BC. The sun is high and fierce and absolutely committed to its work, pressing down on the city with the particular intensity of African equatorial light that makes every color more saturated and every shadow more dramatic, and every surface it touches seem to glow from within with a warmth that has nowhere else on earth quite its equivalent. The streets of Meroe are wide and busy, a constant flowing movement of merchants and priests and soldiers and craftsmen and ordinary citizens going about the business of their lives with the unhurried confidence of people who live in a city that has been prosperous for centuries and expects to remain so. The marketplace is a place of extraordinary sensory abundance. The smell of frankincense and myrrh rising in thin, pale columns from the stalls of the incense traders, mingling in the warm air with the sharper, more metallic smell of the iron foundries working at the city's edges, and beneath both of those, the deep, green, ancient smell of the Nile itself, carrying on the afternoon breeze from the western bank of the river, where the reeds grow thick and the river birds call to each other across the water in voices that have not changed since the first human being stood on these banks and listened to them thousands of years ago. Traders from Egypt and Arabia and India and the deep African interior move through the market with their arms full of goods, ivory and ebony and gold and exotic animals and spices whose names most of the Mediterranean world has never heard, conducting the commerce that makes Meroe one of the wealthiest trading cities in the ancient world. This is the city that Amanirenas was born into. This is the world that shaped her, and it is far more extraordinary than anything the history books ever gave it credit for being. But Meroe was not simply a beautiful city. It was not simply a busy marketplace or a comfortable capital sitting beside a generous river and enjoying the ordinary prosperities of a well-positioned trading nation. It was something far more significant than that. It was the beating heart of a civilization so ancient, so technically accomplished, and so completely, confidently itself that it stands today. When we finally allow ourselves to look at it honestly and fully and without the distorting lens of centuries of historical neglect, as one of the most remarkable achievements in the entire story of human civilization on this planet. And to understand why, we need to talk about three things that defined the kingdom of Kush so completely and so fundamentally that they are inseparable from everything it was and everything it meant and everything it left behind in the ancient world: gold, iron, and pyramids. The gold of Kush was legendary throughout the ancient world, spoken of in Egyptian texts going back thousands of years before Amanirenas was born, coveted by every empire and every trading nation that knew of its existence, and produced in quantities so extraordinary that the kingdom sitting atop the richest gold-producing region in all of Africa had never, in its entire long history, needed to worry about whether it could afford to defend itself. The gold came from the mines of the Nubian desert, worked by skilled miners who had been extracting it from the earth for generations using techniques refined over centuries of continuous practice. It flowed outward from Kush along the trade routes in every direction, finding its way into the treasuries and the jewelry and the religious objects of civilizations from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, carrying with it the quiet, persistent message that wherever this gold came from, Something extraordinary was happening. And then there was the iron. Meroe sat atop deposits of iron ore so rich and so extensive that the city's iron industry was, in the ancient world, without parallel anywhere on the African continent. The furnaces burned day and night along the city's outskirts, massive clay-built structures fed by charcoal and operated by craftsmen whose knowledge of metallurgy had been passed down through generations with the careful, proprietary pride of people who understand that what they know is genuinely valuable. The iron they produced was used for weapons and tools and agricultural implements. Plows that turned the Nubian soil more efficiently than anything available elsewhere in the region. Spear tips and arrowheads of a quality that gave Kushite warriors a genuine military advantage over enemies armed with lesser materials. And the slag heaps left behind by Meroe's iron industry, the accumulated waste of centuries of continuous smelting, still exist today, rising from the Sudanese desert like small mountains of ancient industrial history, visible testimony to the extraordinary scale of what was produced here. And now we must speak of something that sits at the very heart of everything that makes the kingdom of Kush so completely, so fundamentally different from every other major civilization of the ancient world. Something that the Greeks noticed and recorded with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Something that the Romans encountered and struggled with the limited imagination that their own deeply patriarchal society afforded them to fully comprehend or categorize or fit into the framework of assumptions about power and gender and the natural order of things that their civilization had spent centuries carefully constructing and defending. Something that makes Kush, in the eyes of anyone willing to look at it honestly and fully, one of the most extraordinary experiments in human governance that the ancient world ever produced. We must speak of the Kandakes. The word Kandake, rendered in ancient Greek texts as Kandake or Candace, and from which the modern English name Candace is directly descended across 2,000 years of linguistic evolution, was the title given to the ruling queens of Kush. Not the consorts of kings, not the mothers of future rulers holding power temporarily in trust for sons not yet old enough to sit upon the throne, not ceremonial figures performing the outward gestures of authority while the real decisions were made by men standing just outside the frame of the official portrait. The Kandakes of Kush were rulers, full, complete, absolute rulers, possessed of every power and every responsibility and every burden that the governance of a great ancient kingdom entailed, exercising that power in their own names and by their own authority and according to their own judgment, answerable to no man and to no tradition that sought to place the management of their kingdom's affairs in hands other than their own. They led armies into battle. They negotiated treaties with foreign powers. They commissioned the construction of temples and pyramids and the great public works that shaped the physical landscape of their kingdom and expressed, in the most permanent and visible way available to any civilization, its values and its priorities and its understanding of its own identity and its own significance in the world. They were warriors and diplomats and builders and priests and administrators, the full, complete, multidimensional embodiment of royal authority in a civilization that had decided, at some point in its long and thoughtful history, that the capacity for greatness in a ruler had nothing whatsoever to do with the gender of the person exercising it. This was the tradition that Amanirenas was born into. This was the inheritance she would spend her life proving herself worthy of. And this, in the ancient kingdom of Kush, beside the deep, slow waters of the Upper Nile, under the vast and star-filled African sky, was what it meant to be a queen. It is somewhere around the year 57 BC. The city of Meroe is going about the extraordinary, ordinary business of being alive. The iron furnaces burning at the city's edges, the marketplace winding down for the evening as traders pack away their goods and count their profits and make their plans for tomorrow. The Nile running wide and dark and generous beyond the city's western walls, carrying on its ancient current the accumulated history of every civilization that has ever grown up beside it and drawn sustenance from its waters. The pyramids of the royal cemetery rise from the desert to the north of the city, narrow and steep, and catching the last warm light of the African afternoon on their eastern faces before the desert darkness comes in from the west and covers everything in the particular, profound, deeply restful quiet of a Nubian night. And somewhere inside the royal palace of Meroe, in the inner chambers where the most important and most private moments of the Kushite royal family's life unfold away from the eyes of the court and the city, a child is born, a girl, and the world, though it does not yet know it, has just become a more extraordinary place. We do not know the precise details of her birth in the way that modern record-keeping would allow us to know them. We do not have the exact date, the day and the month preserved in some ancient registry, alongside her weight and her mother's name and the name of the physician who attended the delivery. The ancient world did not produce that kind of documentation, and the Meroitic script in which Kushite records were kept has yielded only a fraction of its secrets to the scholars who have spent generations working to decode it. What we know is the year, approximately 57 BC, and the fact of her birth into the royal family of Kush, into the bloodline of the Kandakes, into the tradition of warrior queens that had been shaping the destiny of this extraordinary civilization for generations before she drew her first breath. She was born into greatness. Not the passive, inherited greatness of someone who simply arrives in the right family at the right time and allows the machinery of dynasty to carry them forward without effort or intention or genuine personal investment in the responsibilities they have been given. The active, earned, deeply personal greatness of someone who takes what they have been given and makes it something that the world has never quite seen before. Her name was Amanirenas. In the ancient Meroitic language of her people, that beautiful, complex, still largely undeciphered tongue that was as distinct and as irreducibly itself as the civilization that spoke it, her name carried within it resonances of the divine. Scholars believe it contains a reference to the god Amon, the great creator deity of the Kushite religious tradition, associated with the sun and with wind and with the breath of life itself, worshipped in the magnificent temple complex at the sacred mountain of Gebel Barkal, where the royal family of Kush maintained their deepest and most ancient connection to the divine order of the universe. To name a child after Amon was to place her, from the very first moment of her existence, under the protection of the greatest power in the Kushite cosmos. It was to say, in the language of religious intention, that the ancient world understood with a directness and a seriousness that the modern world has largely lost, that this child was not ordinary, that she was watched over, that she was meant for something, and the world, in time, would discover exactly what that something was. Growing up inside the royal palace of Meroe in the middle of the 1st century BC was not, by any measure of the ancient world, a soft or an indulgent experience. Not for a child born into the bloodline of the Kandaks, not for a girl who carried in her name the resonance of the divine, and in her veins the blood of warrior queens who had commanded armies and negotiated treaties and built temples and governed one of the most complex and demanding kingdoms in the ancient world, with the same absolute, unflinching competence that the tradition demanded of every ruler it produced. Softness was not what the palace of Meroe offered its royal children. What it offered instead was something infinitely more valuable and infinitely more demanding. It offered preparation. Deep, comprehensive, relentlessly thorough preparation for the full weight of everything that the title of Kandake would one day require of the person who carried it. From her earliest years, Amanirenas would have been immersed in the full curriculum of Kushite royal education. A curriculum that was, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinary in both its breadth and its ambition. She would have learned the religious traditions of her people, the complex ancient theology of the Kushite faith, with its pantheon of gods headed by the great Amon of Gebel Barkal and its intricate system of ritual and ceremony and divine obligation that bound the ruling family of Kush to the spiritual life of their kingdom in ways that were simultaneously deeply personal and profoundly political. She would have learned the history of the Kandakes who came before her, their campaigns and their triumphs and their failures and the lessons that each of those experiences contained for anyone wise enough and humble enough to receive them. She would have learned the geography of her kingdom, the routes of the trade caravans moving through the desert, the locations of the iron mines and the gold deposits, the positions of the border fortifications that marked the boundaries between Kush and the civilizations pressing against it from the north. And she would have learned to fight. This is perhaps the most important and most distinctively Kushite element of her education, the one that sets her story apart most completely from the stories of almost every other female ruler in the ancient world. Because the Kandakes of Kush were not simply political rulers who happened to hold military authority in a nominal, ceremonial sense. They were warriors, real ones, trained from childhood in the arts of combat and military strategy with the same seriousness and the same rigor that their male counterparts in other ancient civilizations brought to the same disciplines. Amanirenas learned to draw a bow, that ancient weapon that had given her land its Egyptian name, the land of the bow, with the strength and the precision of a soldier rather than the delicacy of a princess. She learned to ride. She learned the tactics of desert warfare, the strategies of siege and of ambush and of the rapid, unexpected strike that catches an enemy before they have time to organize a coherent defense. She learned, in other words, not just how to be a queen. She learned how to be a Kandake. And in the kingdom of Kush, those were two very different things. There comes a moment in the life of every great ruler, every person who has been prepared from childhood for the full weight of a throne and its responsibilities, when the preparation ends and the reality begins, when education gives way to governance, when the training ground gives way to the actual, irreversible, completely unforgiving arena of real power with real consequences and real human lives depending on every decision made within it. For Amanirenas, that moment arrived in approximately the year 40 BC, when she was somewhere around 17 years old, young by our modern understanding of readiness and maturity, but not young by the standards of the ancient world, which asked its rulers to grow up faster and carry more weight earlier than anything our contemporary experience of childhood and adolescence would consider reasonable or appropriate. She was ready. Everything her education had given her, the religious knowledge and the military training and the historical understanding, and the deep, comprehensive familiarity with the geography and the economics and the political landscape of her kingdom had been building toward this moment. And it was in this moment that she met the man who would stand beside her for the years ahead, the man who would share the weight of the kingdom with her, the man whose loss would one day cost her more than any battle ever could. His name was Teretekas, and he was, by every account available to us, exactly the kind of king that a Kandake of Kush deserved to have beside her. The precise circumstances of their union, the negotiations between families, the religious ceremonies, the specific rituals through which the Kushite royal tradition marked the joining of two lives and two lines of authority into a single governing partnership, are not preserved in the historical record with the detail that we would wish for. But what is preserved in the architectural and artistic record of their reign and in the fragments of historical documentation that have survived the long erosion of time is the essential character of what they built together. They were co-rulers in the fullest and most genuine sense of that term. Not a king with a queen consort performing the ceremonial functions of royal femininity at his side, but two rulers of equal authority and complementary ability governing their kingdom as genuine partners. The inscriptions from their reign refer to them together, Teretekas and Amanirenas, side by side in the official record, their names carrying equal weight in the formal language of Kushite royal documentation. He brought to the partnership the particular qualities that his own preparation and his own character had developed in him. Steady, thoughtful, strategic intelligence, a patient and methodical approach to the complex challenges of governance, and the particular kind of quiet, confident authority that inspires trust in the people, who serve under it without ever needing to raise its voice or display its power in ways that diminish those around it. And Amanirenas brought everything that she was, everything that the palace of Meroe and the tradition of the Kandakes and the long, demanding years of her royal education had made of her, to the partnership they were building together. She brought her military training and her religious knowledge and her deep understanding of the kingdom she'd been prepared since childhood to serve. She brought her intelligence, sharp and precise and capable of moving between the practical and the strategic, with the fluid ease of a mind that has been trained to hold multiple levels of complexity simultaneously without losing its grip on any of them. And she brought something that no education can fully produce and no tradition can entirely instill, something that was simply, irreducibly hers. Her will, her absolute, unshakable, completely inexhaustible will. Together, in the warm Nubian afternoons of their early reign, with the Nile running generous and full beyond the palace walls, and the iron furnaces burning through the Meroe nights, and the pyramids of their ancestors rising from the desert to the north like silent witnesses to everything they were building. They were extraordinary. The years between approximately 40 BC and 30 BC, the first decade of the reign of Amanirenas and Teretekas, were, by the standards of a world that was almost everywhere else, convulsing with the particular violence and instability of an era in which the old orders were collapsing and the new ones had not yet fully established themselves, a period of remarkable peace and prosperity for the kingdom of Kush. The Mediterranean world to the north was tearing itself apart with a ferocity that must have been audible even in the quiet of the Nubian desert. Julius Caesar had been assassinated in Rome in 44 BC, triggering a series of civil wars and power struggles that would consume the Roman world for the better part of 2 decades and cost it an almost incomprehensible quantity of blood and treasure and human suffering before they finally resolved themselves into the ordered, efficient, iron-fisted stability of Augustus Caesar's imperial regime. Egypt, Kush's immediate northern neighbor, was navigating the extraordinary complexities of Cleopatra's reign, that brilliant, desperate, ultimately doomed attempt to preserve Egyptian independence through a combination of political genius and strategic alliance with the most powerful Romans of the age. The entire Mediterranean world, in other words, was in the grip of forces so large and so violent, and so completely beyond the control of any individual actor within the system, that the wisest thing any ruler on its edges could do was exactly what Amanirenas and Teritechus were doing: governing well, trading carefully, maintaining their borders with quiet confidence, and watching. And the kingdom of Kush, under their steady and capable joint stewardship, was thriving. The trade routes that passed through Meroe were active and profitable, the caravans moving north toward Egypt and south into the African interior and east toward the Red Sea ports where the goods of Arabia and India arrived in exchange for the gold and the iron and the ivory and the exotic animals that Kush had to offer. The iron industry was producing at capacity, its furnaces burning through the Nubian nights with the steady, reliable energy of an industrial operation that has found its rhythm and settled into it with comfortable confidence. The temples of Meroe were maintained with the careful, devoted attention that the Kushite religious tradition demanded, their walls covered in the bold, confident images of the gods and the rulers who served them, their precincts filled with the smoke of incense and the sound of ritual and the particular quality of sacred attention that a civilization pays to the divine when it feels secure enough in its material circumstances to give its spiritual life the care and the energy it deserves. And the people of Kush, the farmers working the rich black soil along the Nile banks, the craftsmen in their workshops, the traders in the marketplace, the soldiers on the border, the priests in the temples, the ordinary men and women going about the extraordinary, ordinary business of their daily lives in one of the ancient world's most remarkable civilizations, were going about that business with the particular confidence and ease of people who feel, in the most fundamental and physical way, that they are safe, that their kingdom is in good hands, that the 2 figures on the throne of Meroe, the steady king and the fierce, brilliant queen beside him, are equal to whatever the world might bring to their door. They were right to feel that way. For now, for these golden, unhurried, deeply precious years of peace and prosperity and the quiet accumulation of everything a kingdom needs to be strong, they were right. But the world to the north was changing, and the change was coming south, slowly at first, then all at once. It is the year 30 BC, and in the city of Alexandria, that magnificent, cosmopolitan, heartbreakingly beautiful metropolis on the northern coast of Egypt, where the greatest library in the ancient world housed the accumulated knowledge of centuries, and the harbor was always busy with the ships of a dozen nations, and the streets rang with the voices of people speaking every language the Mediterranean world had produced. Something is happening that will send shockwaves through the entire ancient world. Something so enormous, so completely and permanently transformative in its implications, that nothing that comes after it will ever quite be the same. Egypt, ancient, magnificent, 3,000-year-old Egypt, the civilization that had stood as one of the defining powers of the ancient world since before most other civilizations had learned to write their own names, is falling. And it is falling not to an army or a plague or an internal rebellion or any of the other forces that had threatened it across its long and eventful history. It is falling to a man, one cold, calculating, extraordinarily capable man. His name is Octavian, and history will remember him as Augustus Caesar. The story of how Egypt fell is, in many ways, the story of Cleopatra VII, the last and most brilliant of the Ptolemaic pharaohs, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and political genius who had kept her kingdom independent and powerful through sheer force of will and diplomatic brilliance for over 2 decades. She had allied herself first with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony, the 2 most powerful Romans of their respective moments. In a series of political and romantic partnerships that were, whatever else they were, the most strategically sophisticated attempts to preserve Egyptian independence available to her in the circumstances she inherited. But the Battle of Actium in 31 BC had ended everything. Octavian's fleet had destroyed the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra in a single decisive afternoon engagement off the western coast of Greece, and the world that Cleopatra had spent her life trying to maintain had collapsed in the hours that followed with a speed and a completeness that left no room for recovery or negotiation or any of the other tools that her extraordinary intelligence had always found available to her before. Mark Antony was dead, fallen on his own sword in the chaotic, desperate hours following the battle. Cleopatra herself was dead. Having taken her own life in the royal mausoleum she had prepared in Alexandria rather than be taken to Rome as a trophy of Octavian's triumph. And Octavian, now styling himself Augustus, the revered one, the first citizen of Rome, and the undisputed master of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, was walking through the streets of Alexandria as its conqueror. He visited the tomb of Alexander the Great and placed a wreath upon it with his own hands. He looked at the body of Cleopatra with the cold, assessing the eyes of a man calculating what her death meant for his plans rather than feeling anything about it as a human event. And then he turned his attention to the administration of his new province. Egypt was Roman now. And to the south of Egypt, in the warm golden desert beyond the first cataract of the Nile, the kingdom of Kush was watching, and Amanirenas, sitting beside Teritekas in the throne room of Meroe, receiving the reports of her intelligence network with the focused, careful attention of a ruler who understands that the fall of a neighbor is never simply a neighbor's problem, was already thinking. The fall of Egypt changed everything for the kingdom of Kush, not immediately, not in the sudden, dramatic, overnight way that the most visible historical turning points tend to announce themselves in the popular imagination, but in the slower, more insidious, more genuinely dangerous way that the most consequential changes in the ancient world almost always actually operated, gradually, incrementally, through the quiet accumulation of small shifts and subtle pressures, and the gradual reorientation of powerful forces that had previously been pointed in other directions, but were now, with Egypt absorbed and pacified and efficiently incorporated into the Roman imperial system, free to look southward and begin asking questions about what else might be available for the taking. Because Rome, in the year 30 BC, was not a civilization that had learned contentment. It was not an empire that had reached a point of satisfaction with what it had and was prepared to settle into the comfortable management of its existing territories without casting its eyes toward the horizons beyond them. Rome was a hunger, a permanent, insatiable, brilliantly organized and devastatingly effective hunger for more territory, more resources, more tribute, more proof of its own supremacy and its own divine mandate to govern the world. And the world that lay immediately to the south of its new Egyptian province was, from Rome's perspective, extraordinarily tempting. The kingdom of Kush was wealthy. Its gold mines and its iron industry and its position at the center of the ancient African trade network had made it one of the richest kingdoms in the region, and Rome had an unerring instinct for wealth, the way that certain animals have an unerring instinct for water in a dry landscape. It was also, from Rome's perspective, apparently vulnerable, governed by a queen in a world where Rome's deepest assumptions told it that governance by women was inherently inferior to governance by men, and therefore inherently more susceptible to the kind of pressure that Roman military power was so extraordinarily good at applying. These assumptions were, as Amanirenas would demonstrate with a thoroughness and a definitiveness that left no room for doubt, catastrophically wrong. But Rome did not know that yet, and so it appointed a man named Gaius Cornelius Gallus as the first Roman prefect of Egypt and sent him south toward the Kushite border with the comfortable confidence of an empire that has never seriously considered the possibility of being stopped. Gallus was a man of considerable talent and almost limitless self-regard. He was a soldier and a poet, an unusual combination that his contemporaries found either charming or irritating depending on their relationship to him. And he brought to his new role as prefect of Egypt the particular energy of a man who understands that he has been given an important assignment and intends to make the most of it in ways that will reflect well upon himself. He marched his forces south toward the Kushite border with the brisk, purposeful efficiency of Roman military movement, covering the ground between Alexandria and the first cataract of the Nile with the speed and the organization that the Roman army had spent centuries perfecting. He arrived at the ancient border region with the air of a man arriving somewhere that already belongs to him, even if the paperwork has not quite caught up with that reality yet. And when he arrived, he did something that tells you everything you need to know about the nature of the miscalculation that Rome was in the process of making. He erected a monument, a large one, celebrating himself. The monument that Gaius Cornelius Gallus erected at the ancient border site of Philae, that sacred island in the Nile where the river narrows between smooth granite boulders worn by thousands of years of flowing water, and the air smells of warm stone and ancient river mud, and the particular quality of holiness that accumulates in places where human beings have been coming to worship for longer than recorded history can reach, was not simply a monument. It was a statement, a declaration, a carefully constructed, elaborately inscribed three-language announcement, written in Latin and Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphics so that absolutely nobody within reading distance could claim they had missed the message. Of Roman supremacy, Roman permanence, and the particular brand of Roman certainty that everything it surveyed was, by definition and by divine right, Roman property. The inscription celebrated Gallus's military achievements in terms so extravagant and so breathlessly self-congratulatory that even some of his Roman contemporaries found it embarrassing. It spoke of victories and campaigns and personal bravery and extraordinary service to Augustus Caesar with the unrestrained enthusiasm of a man who has decided that modesty is a virtue considerably overrated by people who have less to be immodest about than he does. But the monument was not merely an act of personal vanity. It was also, and more significantly, an act of territorial claim. By erecting it at Philae, at the traditional boundary between Egypt and the Kushite world, Gallus was planting Rome's flag in the borderlands between the two civilizations and saying, in the most visible and permanent way available to him, that this was now Roman territory, that the boundary had moved, that whatever arrangements and understandings and tacit agreements had previously governed the relationship between Egypt and Kush were now superseded by the simple, overwhelming fact of Roman power. And alongside this act of territorial assertion came something even more provocative, something that struck at the economic heart of the Kushite kingdom with a directness and a presumption that left no room for ambiguity about what Rome intended. Taxes. Rome began attempting to impose taxation on the Kushite communities living in the border regions, demanding payment in acknowledgement of Roman authority over territories that the Kingdom of Kush had always considered within its own sphere of influence. In the palace of Meroe, 200 miles to the south, Amanirenas received reports of the monument and the taxation with the particular quality of attention that a ruler gives to information that confirms a suspicion they have been carrying for some time. She had watched Egypt fall. She had watched Rome install its prefect and begin the systematic process of incorporating her northern neighbor into the imperial system. She had understood, with the clear-eyed strategic intelligence that her entire education had been designed to produce, that the fall of Egypt was not simply Egypt's problem, that it was the opening move in a sequence that, if allowed to proceed unchecked, would eventually arrive at the gates of Meroe with the same expectations of submission that it had presented to every other civilization it had encountered on its southward march. And now here was the confirmation. The monument, the taxes, the quiet, arrogant, completely unambiguous announcement that Rome had arrived and intended to stay, and expected Kush to adjust its understanding of itself and its sovereignty accordingly. Amanirenas looked at this information. She considered it carefully, and then she began with the methodical patience of a woman who has been trained since childhood to think before she acts, but to act decisively when the thinking is done, to plan. There is a particular kind of strategic intelligence that the ancient world produced in its greatest military minds, an intelligence that is not simply about knowing things or planning things or even executing plans with extraordinary precision and effectiveness. It is an intelligence that is fundamentally, essentially, irreducibly about timing, about the ability to watch and wait and observe with absolute stillness while the world around you moves and shifts and reveals, in its movement and its shifting, the precise moment when everything that has been building quietly beneath the surface is finally ready to break open into something decisive and irreversible. The hunter knows that the most important thing is not the speed of the charge, but the choosing of the moment to begin it. The general who understands that the difference between a victory and a defeat is sometimes nothing more than the difference between acting now and acting 5 minutes from now. This intelligence, this profound, patient, almost preternatural sense of timing, was one of the defining qualities of Amanirenas as a military commander. And in the year 26 BC, the world handed her a moment so perfectly constructed, so precisely aligned with everything she had been waiting and planning and preparing for, that it must have felt less like an opportunity and more like an answer to a prayer. Augustus Caesar, in the restless expansionist year of 26 BC, decided to launch a military expedition into Arabia. The Arabian Peninsula, that vast, mysterious, extraordinarily wealthy territory sitting at the crossroads of the ancient world's most profitable trade routes, had been attracting Roman attention for some time, and Augustus, with the characteristic ambition of a man who has never quite learned the art of being satisfied with what he already has, decided that the time had come to extend Rome's reach into it. He appointed his prefect of Egypt, a man named Aelius Gallus, the successor to the monumentally self-regarding Cornelius Gallus, who had by this point been recalled to Rome in disgrace for his own excessive self-promotion, to lead the expedition. And Aelius Gallus, with the efficient, methodical competence of a Roman military commander doing exactly what Roman military commanders were trained to do, began assembling his forces. He needed soldiers, a great many soldiers. Soldiers that could only come from the Roman garrison stationed in Egypt, the garrison that had been positioned there, among other reasons, specifically to maintain Roman authority over the southern border with Kush, and to serve as a deterrent against exactly the kind of military action that Amanirenas had been quietly contemplating. He took approximately 10,000 soldiers from the Egyptian garrison. He organized his supply lines with Roman thoroughness. He made his preparations with Roman efficiency. And then, in the year 26 BC, he marched his army away from Egypt, away from the Nile, away from the southern border, away from the fortified positions that had been maintaining the Roman military presence in the borderlands between Egypt and Kush, and left that border virtually unguarded behind him. The door was open. For the first time since Rome had arrived in Egypt and planted its flag and erected its monument and begun imposing its taxes, the military machine that backed all of those provocations was somewhere else, distracted, committed to another theater, unable to respond with its full force to anything that might happen in the south while it was occupied with its Arabian adventure. Amanirenas had been watching for this moment with the patient, absolute attention of a woman who understood, in the most fundamental part of her strategic intelligence, that it would come. And now it had come. She turned to Teretekas beside her on the throne of Meroe. And the decision that they made together in that moment, in the warm afternoon light of the Kushite palace, with the Nile running full and the iron furnaces burning and the pyramids of their ancestors standing silent witness in the desert to the north, would change the ancient world forever. The decision had been made, and now the work began. Not the work of impulse or anger or the kind of reactive, poorly considered military action that is driven more by emotion than by calculation, and that tends, with the depressing regularity of all poorly considered things, to end badly for the people who undertake it, but the work of preparation. Deep, thorough, meticulously organized preparation. The kind that takes weeks and months of careful planning and quiet, disciplined execution, and the patient assembly of every resource and every advantage available to the people doing it before a single warrior takes a single step in the direction of the enemy. Because Amanirenas understood something about warfare that the most dangerous military commanders in history have always understood, and that the merely brave ones have consistently failed to grasp. That the battle is won or lost in the preparation, long before the first weapon is raised, or the first drum is sounded, or the first line of warriors moves forward into the uncertain, irreversible momentum of actual combat. She was going to fight Rome, and she was going to win, and winning required everything to be right before anything began. She sent her intelligence gatherers north, quietly, carefully, in the guise of traders and pilgrims and ordinary travelers moving through the border regions on the kind of unremarkable business that attracts no particular attention from the soldiers and officials of an occupying power that has not yet learned to look carefully at the people moving through its territory. They traveled to Syene, the great ancient city at the first cataract of the Nile, known today as Aswan, sitting where the river narrows between pink granite boulders worn smooth by millennia of flowing water, and the air is drier and hotter and more ancient feeling than almost anywhere else on earth. They travelled to Elephantine, the island city in the middle of the Nile at Sienne, connected to both banks by the steady commerce of riverboats carrying goods and people across the dark water. They travelled to Philae, that sacred island downstream where Gallus had erected his monument and where the temple of the goddess Isis drew worshippers from across the ancient world to its beautifully carved precincts. And they counted. They counted Roman soldiers and mapped Roman fortifications and assessed Roman supply lines and evaluated Roman defensive preparations with the careful, comprehensive attention of people who understood that the information they were gathering was going to determine the difference between a successful campaign and a catastrophic one. What they brought back to Amanirenas confirmed everything she had hoped and planned for. The Roman garrisons at all three cities were skeleton forces, reduced to their minimum viable strength by the departure of Aelius Gallus's Arabian expedition, staffed by soldiers who had settled into the comfortable routines of border duty in a region that had shown no signs of military threat and who were, as a consequence, considerably less alert and considerably less prepared for the kind of sudden, overwhelming, completely unexpected assault that Amanirenas was planning than they would have been under normal circumstances. She assembled her army. 30,000 warriors, drawn from across the kingdom of Kush, called together under the banner of their Kandake, with a speed and a discipline that spoke of a military tradition that had been maintaining its readiness for exactly this kind of moment for generations. They came from the farms along the Nile and the desert communities of the interior and the border garrison towns where Kushite soldiers had been watching Roman movements with quiet, patient attention for years. They came armed with the weapons of the Kushite military tradition, the great bows of Tarseti, the spears and the swords and the shields of a warrior culture that had been fighting and winning in this landscape since long before Rome existed. And they gathered in the desert south of the border in the warm Nubian nights under the vast star-filled African sky, and they waited for their queen to give the order. They moved at night. Amanirenas understood, with the deep tactical intelligence that had been her inheritance and her training since childhood, that the greatest weapon available to a force striking against a larger and better resourced empire is not strength alone. It is a surprise, and surprise in the ancient world of military campaigns conducted across open desert terrain under skies so clear and so brilliantly lit by stars that a careful observer can see for miles in every direction, requires darkness. It requires silence. It requires the kind of collective, disciplined stillness that only an army that genuinely believes in what it is fighting for, that understands in the most personal and immediate way the stakes of what it is undertaking, can sustain across miles of difficult terrain in the small hours of the night when the body's natural rhythms are pulling it toward rest and the mind needs something stronger than mere orders to keep it focused and alert and completely committed to the task at hand. 30,000 warriors moving through the Nubian desert in the darkness toward the Roman border, and the extraordinary thing, the thing that speaks most powerfully to the quality of the force that Amanirenas had assembled and the quality of the commander who had assembled it, is that they made almost no sound at all. They moved in long, disciplined columns along routes that Amanirenas's scouts had mapped with painstaking care in the weeks of preparation preceding the campaign. Routes that avoided the Roman observation posts and patrol patterns that her intelligence gatherers had identified during their careful reconnaissance of the border region. Their weapons were wrapped in cloth to prevent the metallic ring of bronze against bronze from carrying through the clear desert air to ears that were not meant to hear it. Their footsteps were absorbed by the warm sand with the quiet efficiency of people who have been moving through this landscape their entire lives and know, in the most physical and instinctive way, how to let it swallow the evidence of their passage. They crossed the ancient borderlands between Kush and Roman Egypt in the grey pre-dawn darkness, moving with the quiet, purposeful momentum of a river that has been dammed for too long and has finally found its way past the obstacle. And then, as the first pale light of the African dawn began to separate the eastern horizon from the sky above it, they arrived at Syene, at the city sitting where the Nile narrows between its ancient granite boulders, where the Roman garrison was waking to what it expected to be another unremarkable morning on a quiet provincial border, and found instead 30,000 Kushite warriors emerging from the desert, with the absolute focused fury of a people who have been insulted and taxed and underestimated for long enough. Syene fell quickly, its skeleton garrison reduced to a fraction of its normal strength by the departure of Aelius Gallus's Arabian expedition, and caught completely unprepared by the speed and the scale and the absolute unexpectedness of the assault, had no meaningful defense to offer against the force that descended on it from the desert in the early morning light. The fighting was fierce but brief. Roman soldiers who had gone to sleep the previous night in the comfortable assumption that their border was secure woke to the sound of Kushite war drums and the sight of Kushite warriors moving through their streets with the disciplined, purposeful efficiency of an army that has been planning this moment for months and knows exactly what it is doing. Then Elephantine fell. That island city in the Nile, where the river traffic had always made it one of the most commercially important sites in the border region, its wharves and its warehouses and its garrison overwhelmed by the same relentless Kushite momentum that had just consumed Syene. And then Philae, the sacred island where Gallus had planted his monument, where Rome had declared its supremacy in 3 languages carved into stone. Amanirenas' warriors took it apart with their hands. They pulled the monument down piece by piece and scattered its fragments in the Nile mud, returning to the river the arrogance that Rome had tried to make permanent, letting the water have it, letting it be carried away downstream toward the Mediterranean and the empire that had sent it south with such breathtaking presumption. 3 cities. 1 campaign. Rome's southern border, the border that Augustus Caesar's empire had established with such confidence and such certainty of its own permanence, was gone. Among the many remarkable things that Amanirenas' warriors did in the captured Roman border cities in the hours and days following the fall of Syene and Elephantine and Philae, the securing of prisoners, the assessment of captured supplies and weapons, the establishment of Kushite military control over the newly taken territory, the sending of swift messengers south to Meroe carrying the news of the campaign's extraordinary opening success. There was one act so completely, so perfectly, so almost poetically constructed in its symbolism that it has echoed down through 2,000 years of history with its full original power entirely intact. It was not the most militarily significant thing that happened in those captured cities. It was not the most practically consequential, but it was, in its quiet, deliberate, absolutely precise way, the most eloquent. And it began with a statue. In each of the 3 captured Roman border cities, Augustus Caesar had erected statues of himself, those carefully crafted, officially sanctioned portraits of the emperor that Rome placed throughout its territories as a constant, visible reminder of who was in charge and whose authority governed the lives of everyone within reach of the empire's long and possessive arms. They were bronze figures of considerable artistic quality, products of the same Hellenistic sculptural tradition that had been producing images of powerful men for centuries, rendered with the technical skill and the idealized realism that Roman official portraiture had refined into one of the ancient world's most effective instruments of political communication. They stood in the public spaces of the captured cities on their stone plinths, looking out over the streets and the markets and the river with the composed, authoritative expressions of a power that was expected to be permanent. Amanirenas' warriors took them down. Everyone. They pulled them from their plinths with the particular satisfaction of people dismantling something that was never supposed to be there in the first place, and returning the landscape to its proper condition. Most of the statues were destroyed or melted down, or simply discarded in the chaos of the campaign's aftermath. But one was not. One, the bronze portrait head of Augustus Caesar himself, separated from its body during the destruction of its statue, a masterpiece of ancient sculpture with glass and stone eyes that gave it an almost living quality and features rendered with extraordinary sensitivity and skill. Sas. Qu'est-ce que me s'entend? Carried south with deliberate care by the warriors returning to Meroe, brought into the heart of the Kushite kingdom as a trophy of war unlike any other, and then placed by the specific instruction of Amanirenas herself in a location so perfectly chosen, so precisely calibrated in its symbolic meaning, that it feels less like a decision made by a human being in the aftermath of a military campaign, and more like something that was always going to happen, a conclusion that the story had been moving toward from the moment Rome first planted its arrogant monument in the Kushite borderlands and called it civilization. The head of Augustus Caesar was buried beneath the threshold of a Kushite temple, beneath the steps, on the earth, in the exact place where every single person who entered that sacred space would walk across it without knowing it was there. Every priest goes to his morning duties. Every worshipper brings offerings to the gods. Every warrior returns from the field. Every ordinary citizen of Meroe lived their ordinary, extraordinary life in a kingdom that had just reminded the most powerful empire in the world that there were places its authority did not reach and people its power could not move. All of them walking every single day across the face of the man who had sent his armies to take what was theirs. It was not cruelty. It was not anger. It was something far more sophisticated and far more permanent than either of those things. It was contempt. Quiet, absolute, 2,000-year-long contempt. And it was perfect. And then the joy ended. Not slowly. Not with the gradual, warning-filled diminishment that allows the people experiencing it to prepare themselves, at least partially, for what is coming, but suddenly, with the particular savage abruptness of the worst kinds of loss. The ones that arrive without announcement, without ceremony, without any of the transitional kindness that the human heart needs to move from one state of being to another without breaking completely. The campaign in the north had been everything that Amanirenas and Teritekas had planned and prepared and hoped for. 3 cities taken, a monument torn down, the bronze head of the most powerful man in the world buried beneath Kushite feet in the most eloquent possible statement of what Kush thought of Roman supremacy. By every measure available to them in the ancient world of military assessment and political calculation, they had succeeded beyond anything that could reasonably have been expected of a campaign conducted against the most powerful empire in the known world. They had won, and victory in the ancient world, as in every world since, should have been a moment of joy, of relief. of the particular profound gratitude that soldiers and commanders feel when the fighting is done and the cost has been paid and the thing that was fought for has been secured. It should have been all of those things, and it was none of them, because somewhere in the fighting, in the fierce, chaotic, close-quarters violence of those captured border cities, in the brutal intimacy of ancient combat where the difference between a commander directing a battle and a warrior fighting in one could sometimes be measured in nothing more than a few feet of contested ground, King Teritechus was killed. The precise circumstances of his death are not preserved in any source available to us with the specific detail that the human heart, reaching back across 2,000 years toward this moment, wishes it could find. We do not know which city he was in when it happened. We do not know whether the blow that killed him came from a Roman sword or a Roman spear or an arrow loose from a Roman bow in the desperate, disorganized fighting of a city being taken street by street in the early morning light. We do not know whether he died quickly or slowly, in the middle of the fighting or in its aftermath, surrounded by his warriors, or alone in some narrow street of a captured city far from the river and the desert and the pyramid-studded skyline of the kingdom he had governed with such steady, capable dedication for a decade. What we know is only the essential, irreducible, devastating fact of it. He went north with his queen and his army, full of purpose and resolve, and the particular quiet courage of a man who understands completely what he is fighting for and has made his peace with the cost of fighting for it. And he did not come back. And Amanirenas, standing somewhere in the warm Nubian afternoon, in a landscape rearranged overnight by the violence of the campaign she had set in motion, receiving the news of his death from the mouth of a messenger whose face she would probably never be able to forget, became, in that single, irreversible moment, something she had never been before. She became alone on the throne of Kush, alone with the responsibility for 300,000 people who were counting on her to know what to do next, alone with the grief of a woman who has lost the person she built her life beside, in the worst possible way, at the worst possible moment, with no time and no space and no permission to stop and simply feel the full dimensions of what has been taken from her. She was the Kandake of Kush now, the sole ruler, the only authority, and the Roman Empire was already preparing its response to everything she had just done. There is a particular kind of grief that leaders carry that ordinary people who are permitted when loss comes for them to stop and sit with it and let it move through them at its own pace and in its own way, never fully experience. It is the grief of the person who cannot stop, who cannot close the door of the throne room and pull the curtains against the light and allow themselves the fundamental human luxury of falling apart completely in the privacy of their own devastation. Because the moment they close that door, there are 300,000 people on the other side of it whose safety and whose future and whose most basic daily needs are entirely dependent on the person inside it being, or at least appearing to be, capable of continuing. It is the grief that is carried standing up. That is processed, to whatever extent it can be processed at all, in the margins of the days rather than at their center, in the small hours before the palace wakes, in the brief silences between audiences and councils and military briefings and the 1,000 other demands that the governance of an ancient kingdom makes on the person responsible for it. Amanirenas carried this grief. She carried it from the moment the news of Teritechus's death reached her. And she carried it forward into every subsequent day of her reign with the quiet, steady, completely uncommented upon endurance of a woman who has decided that her people's need for her leadership is greater than her own need for the time and the space to grieve properly. She sat on the throne of Meroe alone now, the seat beside her, the seat that Teritekas had occupied for a decade with the steady, thoughtful, completely reliable presence that she had built her governance around and depended on in ways that she was only now, in his absence, beginning to fully understand the depth of, was empty. And its emptiness was a physical thing, a presence in itself. Something that everyone in the throne room could feel without looking at it directly, the way you feel a gap in a familiar landscape. A tree that has always been there and is suddenly not, leaving behind it a space that the eye keeps returning to with the confused, searching attention of a mind that has not yet fully updated its understanding of the world to incorporate the new reality. She received her advisors and her generals and her ministers with the same focused, authoritative attention that the situation demanded. She made decisions, she issued orders, she administered the complex, daily, unrelenting business of governing a kingdom that was now, in the aftermath of its extraordinary northern campaign, facing the certainty of Roman retaliation with the full, sobering clarity of a ruler who understands that what has been started must now be seen through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal cost. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the demands, in the early mornings before the palace came alive with the sounds of another day beginning, in the late evenings when the last advisor had left and the last lamp burned low in the empty throne room, she allowed herself to feel it, the full, overwhelming, completely unmanageable dimensions of what she had lost. Not just a king, not just a co-ruler whose practical contributions to the governance of their shared kingdom had been invaluable and would now need to be absorbed into her own already considerable workload. But a partner, a companion, the person who had known her most completely, who had seen her at her most certain and her most uncertain, her most brilliant and her most exhausted, her most queenly and her most simply, ordinarily human, and had remained through all of it the steady, warm, completely dependable presence at the center of her life. He was gone, and the throne of Meroe, magnificent and ancient and permanently associated in the historical record with the power and the dignity of the Kandake tradition, had never felt so large or so cold or so completely, devastatingly empty as it felt to Amanirenas in those first quiet evenings of her solitary reign. But grief, however deep and however genuine and however completely deserved, is a luxury that the ancient world rarely permitted its rulers for long, and the ancient world of 24 BC was moving with a speed and a purposefulness that left no room for the Kandake of Kush to remain inside her sorrow any longer than the bare minimum that basic human survival required. Because Rome had heard what happened at Siena and Elephantine and Philae. Rome had received the reports of its captured garrisons and its torn-down monument, and its soldiers marching south into Kushite captivity in chains. Rome had learned that a queen, a woman, a one-woman kingdom on its southern border that it had dismissed with the casual contempt that powerful empires reserve for the things they have not yet bothered to properly assess, had struck its border with 30,000 warriors while its garrison was occupied elsewhere, and had taken 3 of its cities with a speed and an efficiency and a tactical precision that spoke of military planning of a genuinely high order. And Rome was not pleased. Rome was, in the particular way that the most powerful empire in the ancient world expressed its displeasure. cold and methodical and absolutely determined and backed by the full, enormous, terrifying weight of the most effective military machine that human civilization had produced up to that point in its history. Furious. The news reached Augustus Caesar in whatever corner of his vast empire he happened to be administering at the time. The ancient sources are not entirely consistent on his precise location when the dispatches from Egypt arrived, and he received it with the controlled, expressionless attention of a man who has spent his entire career training himself never to show weakness or surprise or emotional reaction in front of witnesses. But behind that controlled expression, the calculations were running with extraordinary speed and extraordinary clarity. 3 Roman cities taken, a Roman garrison captured, a Roman monument destroyed, and the portrait of the emperor himself, the sacred, officially sanctioned image of the divine Augustus, the living embodiment of Roman authority and Roman supremacy, removed from its plinth and carried south into Africa as a trophy by a Kushite army commanded by a queen whose name most Romans could not even pronounce. It was, by any measure of Roman imperial dignity and Roman strategic interest, an outrage, and it required a response. Not a diplomatic one, not a letter of protest, or a demand for the return of the captured soldiers, or a negotiated settlement that acknowledged in any way the legitimacy of what Kush had done. A military one, swift, overwhelming, and designed to demonstrate with absolute clarity that Roman military power had always been its most effective argument that the empire's southern border was not a place where liberties could be taken without consequences of the most serious and permanent kind. He appointed Gaius Petronius as the new prefect of Egypt, and Petronius was everything that the situation demanded: experienced, disciplined, methodical, and possessed of the particular brand of cold professional competence that distinguishes a truly dangerous military commander from merely a courageous one. He was not Cornelius Gallus with his monuments and his poetry and his breathtaking self-regard. He was not a man who confused the performance of power with its actual exercise. He was a soldier, a real one, and he understood with the clear-eyed professional assessment of a man who has been fighting wars his entire adult life and has learned through hard experience what actually determines their outcomes, that the campaign he was being asked to undertake required the kind of thorough, unsentimental, completely realistic preparation that left as little as possible to chance and as much as possible to the controlled, disciplined application of overwhelming force at the right time and the right place. He gathered his legions. He checked his supply lines with Roman thoroughness. He studied the terrain between Egypt and Kush with the focused attention of a man who intends to cross it, accomplish his objective, and return alive. And then, at the head of an army of approximately 10,000 of Rome's most experienced and battle-hardened soldiers, men who had fought in the campaigns that had made Augustus Caesar the master of the Mediterranean world, and who carried in their bearing and their discipline and the quiet confidence of their movement the full accumulated weight of Roman military tradition, Gaius Petronius marched south. Petronius moved south along the Nile with the disciplined, relentless efficiency that was the Roman army's most terrifying characteristic, covering the ground between Egypt and the Kushite heartland with a speed and an organizational competence that left almost no time for the defenders in his path to prepare adequate responses to the force bearing down on them. The Roman legions were, in the ancient world, something genuinely without parallel, not simply as fighting forces, though they were extraordinarily effective fighting forces, but as logistical and organizational achievements of almost incomprehensible sophistication. Each soldier carried his own equipment, his own rations, his own entrenching tools, for building the fortified camps that the legions erected at the end of every single day's march, regardless of how far they had traveled or how difficult the terrain had been. Low earthwork walls with sharpened stakes along their perimeters, laid out according to the same standard plan every time so that every soldier always knew exactly where everything was, regardless of which camp they were in or how exhausted they were when they arrived at it. It was a system refined over centuries of continuous warfare into something approaching a kind of military perfection. And it was moving now through the Nubian landscape with the focused, unstoppable momentum of a force that has been given a clear objective and has absolutely no intention of stopping short of it. Amanirenas met them. She was not a queen who directed her wars from the safety of her palace while others did the actual fighting on her behalf. She was a Kandake, a warrior queen in the fullest and most complete sense of that tradition, and she took the field against Petronius's advancing forces with the personal courage and the direct, hands-on military leadership that the Kandake tradition demanded and that her warriors expected from her. She engaged the Roman forces in a series of fierce encounters in the borderlands north of the Kushite heartland, her warriors fighting with the extraordinary skill and the desperate personal ferocity of people defending their homes and their families and the civilization their ancestors had built over thousands of years of continuous human effort. They fought with their great bows, raining arrows on the advancing Roman formations with a speed and an accuracy that gave even Petronius's experienced soldiers genuine pause, filling the air above the Roman lines with the particular terrifying sound of massed archery that every ancient soldier feared more than almost anything else on the battlefield. They fought with spears and swords in the close quarters engagements that followed when the Romans closed the distance and the battle became the grinding, intimate, deeply personal violence of ancient hand-to-hand combat. They fought with everything they had, and it was not enough, because the Romans kept coming. Slowly, painfully, at enormous cost to both sides, Petronius pushed Amanirenas' forces southward, back through the borderlands, back past the sacred sites and the ancient communities of the Kushite world, back toward the city that embodied everything the kingdom had ever been. Napata, the ancient capital of Kush, the sacred city sitting at the foot of the holy mountain of Gebel Barkal, that magnificent flat-topped sandstone butte rising 295 feet from the desert floor, with the particular dramatic suddenness of a natural monument that the ancient Kushite religious tradition had understood with complete and absolute conviction as the earthly residence of the great god Amon himself. The city where the kings and queens of Kush had been crowned for centuries in ceremonies of extraordinary solemnity and beauty, where the priests of Amon had placed the sacred crown on royal heads, in the innermost sanctuaries of the great temple complex built against the base of the mountain, in rituals so ancient and so deeply embedded in the spiritual identity of the Kushite civilization that they were already old when Rome was young. Petronius reached it in the year 24 BC, and he did what Roman punitive campaigns did when they reached the centers of the civilizations they were punishing. He destroyed it. His soldiers moved through the streets of Napata with the systematic, impersonal efficiency of a military force executing orders, pulling down monuments, stripping temples of their sacred objects, dismantling the physical symbols of Kushite power and cultural identity with the methodical thoroughness of an empire that understands that the most complete way to break a people is not simply to defeat their army, but to reach into the heart of their civilization and damage the things that make them who they are. Thousands of Kushite citizens were taken as slaves, bound and marched northward toward Egypt in long, heartbreaking columns, their faces turning back toward the receding outline of their sacred city, with expressions that no historical record has preserved, but that the human heart, across every century and every culture and every experience of loss that it has ever been asked to absorb, already knows, completely and intimately and in its very deepest places. And then the war reached inside Amanirenas herself and took something that no treaty and no victory and no amount of time would ever fully give back. It is somewhere in the brutal, grinding, costly military engagements of 24 BC, in the fierce, desperate, close-quarters fighting that accompanied Petronius's southward push through Kushite territory, in the dust and the heat and the noise and the confusion of ancient battles where the difference between a commander and a casualty is sometimes nothing more than the random, indifferent trajectory of a single projectile through the thick, chaotic air of a contested battlefield. Amanirenas was in the field. She was always in the field, not directing from a safe distance behind her lines, not receiving reports through intermediaries while her warriors absorbed the actual physical danger of the fighting, but present, completely, personally, physically present in the most dangerous place a Kandake could choose to be, the front. The place where the fighting was happening, where the decisions needed to be made in real time by the person with the authority to make them, where her presence communicated to every warrior around her the most powerful message a commander can send to the people fighting under their leadership. That she was with them, that she was asking nothing of them that she was not asking of herself. That the kingdom they were all fighting for was worth exactly as much to the person on the throne as it was to the people bleeding for it in the dust. And it was there, in that place of absolute personal commitment and absolute physical danger, that it happened. An arrow, most historians believe, though the ancient sources do not specify with certainty the precise nature of the weapon or the exact circumstances of the moment. Something struck her, something moving through the air of that ancient battlefield with the fast, indifferent, completely impersonal purposefulness of ancient projectile weapons. Not knowing or caring whose face it was aimed at, carrying no awareness of the extraordinary life it was about to permanently alter, simply doing what ancient weapons do in the places where ancient battles are fought. It struck her in the eye, and in the seconds that followed, in that brief, disorienting, overwhelming transition between the moment before and the moment after, between the world seen through two eyes and the world seen through one, Amanirenas experienced something that changed her in ways that went far deeper than the physical wound itself. The ancient world had no surgical interventions that could repair the damage of such an injury. No procedures that could restore what had been lost. The wound would heal in the way that wounds in the ancient world healed. Slowly, painfully, imperfectly, leaving behind a scar that was simultaneously a reminder of the event that caused it and a testament to the survival of the person who carried it. But the eye itself was gone, permanently, irreversibly, forever. The Roman historian Strabo recorded this fact about Amanirenas in his geography of the ancient world, that single, dismissive, almost contemptuous line that has come down through the centuries as the entirety of what Rome chose to preserve about one of the most extraordinary acts of physical courage in the ancient world. He called her a masculine sort of woman, blind in one eye. The casual cruelty of that description, the way it reduces a wound suffered in the defense of a civilization to a character flaw, The way it uses the language of gender as an insult against a woman whose crime, in Rome's eyes, was apparently being too effective at things that Rome had decided only men were supposed to be effective at, tells you everything you need to know about the lens through which Rome saw Amanirenas and nothing whatsoever about who she actually was. She was not masculine. She was not defined by her wound. She was a queen who had just lost her eye in a war she was fighting for her people's freedom. And she was going to survive it. Because surviving impossible things was, by this point in her extraordinary life, something that Amanirenas had proven herself better at than almost anyone the ancient world had ever produced. She healed. And then she went back. Those 5 words, so simple, so direct, so completely stripped of the kind of dramatic elaboration that the storytelling instinct reaches for when it encounters something this extraordinary, are perhaps the most powerful 5 words in this entire story. Because they contain within them, in their spare, unhurried simplicity, everything that needs to be said about who Amanirenas was and what she was made of and what she understood about the relationship between the person she was and the responsibility she carried. She healed, not quickly, wounds of that severity in the ancient world with its limited medical interventions and its complete absence of the antiseptic and analgesic technologies that we take entirely for granted. Healed slowly and painfully and imperfectly, leaving the person going through the process in a state of physical vulnerability and diminishment that has no comfortable modern equivalent. She would have been treated by the healers of the Kushite royal household, practitioners of a medical tradition that had been accumulating knowledge and developing techniques for centuries, working with the plant-based medicines and the surgical skills and the combination of practical intervention and spiritual ceremony that ancient medicine invariably brought to its most serious cases. They would have cleaned the wound and bound it and monitored it through the long days of its healing with the careful, devoted attention of people who understood that the life of the Kandake was the most important thing in the kingdom they served. And through all of it, through the pain and the enforced stillness and the slow, frustrating, humbling process of a body repairing itself from the inside out, Amanirenas was thinking. Not retreating into grief or self-pity or the kind of demoralizing internal narrative that physical injury and accumulated loss can produce in people who have not developed the particular mental discipline that surviving extreme circumstances requires. She was thinking about the war, about the state of her forces and the position of Petronius's army and the resources available to her for the continuation of the campaign, about her kingdom, its people and its borders, and the thousands of her citizens who'd been taken north into Roman slavery and whose freedom was, along with the sovereignty of everything they had left behind, the ultimate objective of everything she had already given and everything she was prepared to give still. She was planning. Because the war was not over. Petronius had pushed her forces south and destroyed Napata and demonstrated the considerable and terrifying effectiveness of Roman military power in the field. But he had not broken her. He had not broken her army, and he had not, this was the essential thing, the thing that Rome had consistently failed to understand about the woman it was fighting, broken her will. And so she returned. She came back to her warriors, moving through their ranks in the Nubian landscape south of the destroyed capital with the quiet, absolute, completely unperformable authority of a woman who has been wounded and has healed and has chosen, with full awareness of what that choice means and full acceptance of what it will continue to cost to be here. One-eyed, battle-scarred, upright, the physical evidence of everything the war had taken from her written permanently into the landscape of her face, and carrying it not as a mark of defeat or diminishment, but as what it actually was, a testament, a proof, a permanent, visible, impossible to ignore demonstration of the fact that she had been in the worst of it, and had come through, and was still standing, and was still here, and was still, completely and without qualification, the Kandake of Kush. No speech was needed, no ceremony of return, no elaborate ritual acknowledgement of what she had survived. Her presence was the message. And her warriors, those men and women who had fought beside her through the fall of Napata and the loss of their king and the wounding of their queen, and who had perhaps in the darkest corners of their exhausted hearts begun to wonder whether the thing they were fighting for was still achievable, felt it, in their bones, in their blood, in the deepest, most fundamental part of themselves that understands, without words and without explanation, what it means to watch someone refuse to be defeated. And they gathered themselves, and they prepared to fight again. And now, in the quiet of this night, we must pause and speak of someone who has been moving through the edges of this story since its beginning, present in the background of every battle and every council and every difficult decision that Amanirenas has made in the years since the war began, carrying his share of the kingdom's burden with the quiet, steady, completely uncommented upon reliability of a person who has never needed to be asked twice, and has never once considered the possibility of doing anything other than exactly what the moment requires of him. He is the son of Amanirenas and Teritekas, the child born of the partnership between the steady king and the fierce queen, carrying in him, in the particular combination of qualities that children distill from the people who made them, the best of both his parents. His father's patience, his mother's fire, his father's strategic intelligence, his mother's absolute refusal to accept the world's verdict when that verdict conflicts with what she knows to be right and true and worth fighting for. His name was Akinidad, and he was, in the years of this war, something that Amanirenas needed more than she would perhaps ever have been able to say out loud: proof. Living, breathing, completely present proof that everything she and Teritekas had built together had not died with Teritekas on a battlefield in the north, that it had continued, that it was here, that it was standing beside her in the dust and the heat of the worst moments of the worst war her kingdom had ever faced, and that it was not going anywhere. He had grown up, as we have already understood, in the palace of Meroe, surrounded by the full richness of the Kushite royal tradition, and educated in the complete curriculum that the kingdom prepared for those born into the responsibility of its governance. He had learned the same things his mother had learned: the religious traditions, the military strategies, the geography and the economics and the political landscape of a kingdom that sat at the crossroads of the ancient world and needed its rulers to be capable of managing that complexity with intelligence and care. He had learned to fight, as all Kushite royals learned to fight, with the bow and the spear and the sword, with the physical discipline and the technical skill of a warrior culture that took its military traditions seriously and invested in their transmission from one generation to the next with the same careful, devoted attention it gave to every other aspect of its civilization that it considered worth preserving. And he had watched his father go to war and not come back. He had watched his mother take an arrow in the eye and return to the battlefield. He had watched the sacred city of Napata fall to Roman soldiers who marched through its ancient streets with the impersonal efficiency of people destroying something whose value they could not begin to comprehend. And he had absorbed all of it, All the loss and all the cost and all the devastating accumulating weight of everything the war had already taken from his family and his kingdom, with the quiet, deep-rooted resilience of a young man who has decided in the most fundamental part of himself that these things will not define him, that they will not defeat him, that the appropriate response to everything he has witnessed and everything he has lost is not grief or anger or the paralyzing shock that these accumulated losses might reasonably have produced, but something simpler and more demanding and more completely in keeping with the tradition he was born into. Action. Continued, committed, completely personal action in defense of the kingdom and the people and the civilization that his parents had devoted their lives to protecting. He fought. He fought with the particular intensity of a young man who has something to prove, not to the world, not to Rome, not even to his mother, though he was aware of her watching him with the particular quality of attention that mothers give to children they are proud of and frightened for simultaneously. He fought to prove it to himself, to demonstrate in the only language that the ancient world of military conflict understood as conclusive, that the son of Teritecas and Amanirenas was worthy of the blood he carried and the tradition he had inherited, and the extraordinary weight of the name and the responsibility that had been placed upon him at birth by the simple, profound, completely unchosen fact of who his parents were. He was, in those years of the war, exactly what his mother needed beside her, and exactly what his kingdom needed fighting for it. And the war, with the casual, indifferent brutality that war has always shown toward the people most worth keeping, was about to take him too. The city of Dhaka sits on the western bank of the Nile in what is today the southernmost region of Egypt, a place of ancient pink granite and warm red desert soil and the particular quality of afternoon light that the Nubian landscape produces in the hours before sunset. When the sun has lost its midday ferocity and settled into something warmer and more golden and more willing to let the colors of the world around it speak for themselves without being overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of its presence. In the year 24 BC, it was the site of one of the most fiercely contested military engagements of the entire war between Kush and Rome. A battle in which Kushite warriors and Roman soldiers fought each other in the dust and the heat of the Nubian afternoon with the desperate, deeply personal intensity of people who understand that the ground beneath their feet is ground that matters, that every step yielded to the enemy is a step closer to something that cannot be yielded, that the calculation of cost and benefit that governs the rational mind in moments of lesser consequence has been suspended here in favor of something older and more absolute and less susceptible to the ordinary arguments of survival. They fought, and in the fighting, in the chaos and the noise and the terrible, random, completely indifferent violence of ancient combat, Prince Akinadad was killed. He was young. The precise age is not recorded in any source available to us. The ancient historical record, with its characteristic and sometimes heartbreaking indifference to the details that matter most to the human heart, has not seen fit to preserve for us the number of years that separated the morning of his birth in the palace of Meroe from the afternoon of his death on the banks of the Nile at Dhaka. We know only that he was there, fighting with the courage and the commitment that every account of him suggests was as natural to him as breathing, and that he fell, in the way that young men have always fallen in the wars of the ancient world, with the particular cruelty of a universe that pays no attention whatsoever to merit or worth or the profound and irreplaceable significance of the individual life it is extinguishing. He fell, and the war, which had already taken his father and his mother's eye and the sacred capital of his kingdom, and the freedom of thousands of his people, added his name to its accounting with the same calm, impersonal efficiency with which it had added all the others before him. The news reached Amanirenas. We do not know exactly where she was when it came, whether she was in the field close to the fighting at Dhaka or further south managing the broader military situation of the campaign. We do not know the precise form the words took when they were spoken to her, who delivered them, what they said, whether they came quickly and directly or were approached with the hesitant, circling reluctance of messengers who understand the magnitude of what they are carrying and find themselves unable to simply say it outright. What we know is only the essential, devastating, completely irreducible fact of her receiving them. She had already lost her husband to this war. She had already lost her eye. She had already watched the sacred city of her ancestors fall and her people marched into slavery. And now she had lost her son, her child, the living continuation of everything she and Teritekas had built together. The young man who had stood beside her in the worst of it, with the quiet, steady courage of someone who believed absolutely in what he was fighting for, who had been proof that the partnership she had lost when Teritekas died had not died with him, but had continued forward into the next generation and the next chapter of the kingdom's story. He was gone, and Amanirenas, one-eyed, widowed, childless now in the most complete and permanent sense of that word, stood in the warm Nubian afternoon with the news of his death in her hands and felt something shift inside her, not breaking, not collapsing, not surrendering to the enormous weight of accumulated loss pressing down on her from every direction with a force that would have crushed anyone who was not, in the most fundamental and irreducible part of themselves, made of something that cannot be crushed. Something shifted, something clarified, something that had perhaps always been there. That cold, absolute, completely purposeful determination that had carried her through every previous loss and every previous impossible moment of this extraordinary life, became in that moment more concentrated and more certain and more completely, dangerously itself than it had ever been before. She had nothing left to lose. And a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing the ancient world ever produced, on the same banks of the same river that had sustained her civilization for thousands of years and that continued, with the serene indifference of geological time, to flow south to north through the landscape of her grief as though nothing had changed, and her eye was gone. That permanent physical daily reminder of the cost of this war carried in the altered landscape of her own face, confronting her every morning in the polished bronze surface of her mirror with the evidence of what the conflict had taken from her in the most intimate and irreversible way possible. She had given this war to her husband and her son and her eye. She had given it everything that the human being inside the Queen could be asked to give. And yet the kingdom was still there. The pyramids of her ancestors still rose from the desert north of Meroe, narrow and steep, and reaching for the sky with the same elegant urgency they had always had, completely indifferent to the events unfolding around their ancient bases in the way that only things built for eternity can be indifferent to the urgencies of the present moment. The Nile still ran through the heart of the kingdom, still flooded in its season and receded in its season, and still left behind the rich black soil that fed the people living along its banks. Those people, her people, the 300,000 souls of the kingdom of Kush, whose safety and whose freedom and whose future were the entire reason this war was being fought, were still there. Some of them were enslaved in the north. Some of them were fighting in the field. Some of them work their farms and tend their children and go to the temples and live the ordinary, extraordinary daily lives that the existence of a free kingdom makes possible. All of them depend on her, all of them looking to her, this one-eyed, widowed, childless queen, sitting in the Nubian darkness with the weight of every loss she had ever suffered pressing down on her from every direction, as the person between them and the Roman Empire's decision about what their future would look like. She could not stop. She would not stop. The kingdom was still there. And as long as the kingdom was still there, Amanirenas of Kush had a reason to get up in the morning, and a war to finish, and a people to bring home to the freedom they deserved. And that, in the end, in the deepest and most honest accounting of what keeps extraordinary people moving through impossible circumstances, was enough. In the year 23 BC, one of the most strategically significant positions in the entire theatre of the war between Kush and Rome, Petronius had established it as a key stronghold during his southward campaign, a heavily fortified position on high ground with clear lines of sight in every direction, thick walls built with Roman engineering thoroughness, supplies stockpiled with Roman logistical care, and a garrison of experienced soldiers maintaining the kind of disciplined, watchful readiness that Roman military training produced as a matter of course. It sat on its rock above the river with the solid, well-engineered confidence of Roman military architecture, projecting the empire's authority and its permanence into the surrounding landscape with every carefully laid stone of its construction. And Amanirenas looked at it and saw not a symbol of Roman permanence, but a vulnerability. She assembled her forces with a speed that must have surprised even her most experienced generals, drawing warriors from across the remaining Kushite military resources, calling in every fighter still available to her, organizing her campaign with the focused, clear-eyed, strategic intelligence that had defined her military leadership from the very beginning of this war. She moved north through the desert in the fierce Nubian heat of 23 BC, pushing her warriors through conditions that would have stopped a less determined force, covering the ground between the Kushite heartland and the Roman position at Premnis with the quiet, relentless momentum of a woman who has been moving toward this moment through years of loss and pain and the grinding, costly attrition of a war that has taken everything from her except the one thing it needed to take to win. She arrived at Premnis. She surrounded it with the methodical completeness of a siege commander who has studied her enemy carefully enough to know exactly where the pressure needs to be applied and exactly how much of it will be required to produce the result she is looking for. She cut off its supply lines. She established her positions. She settled in with the patient, absolute certainty of someone who has already decided how this ends. And the Romans inside Premnis looked out from their high walls at the encircling Kushite forces and felt, for perhaps the first time in the entire course of this conflict, the particular cold discomfort of a military force that has just realized it is no longer the one setting the terms of the engagement. The Kushite warriors said they did not know who Caesar was. Roman envoys or military representatives, men accustomed to the effect that the name of Augustus Caesar reliably produced in every other corner of the known world, men who had watched that name end arguments and establish hierarchies and remind people on the receiving end of Roman authority exactly where they stood in the order of things, found themselves face to face with warriors from the kingdom of Kush in the complex, fluid landscape of the negotiations and military engagements of this period. And in the course of that encounter, they did what Romans always did when they needed to remind someone of the ultimate authority behind every Roman demand. They invoked the emperor. They said his name with the full weight of imperial gravity that Romans always brought to its speaking. Augustus Caesar, the most powerful man alive, the master of the known world. They said it, and they waited for the effect that it always produced. And the Kushite warriors looked at them, and they said, with a calm and directness and a complete absence of the performance of either deference or defiance that makes the response so extraordinary, so much more unsettling than any dramatic gesture of contempt could ever have been, that they did not know this person, that the name meant nothing to them, that whatever authority it was supposed to carry, whatever reminder of Roman supremacy it was intended to deliver, whatever adjustment of attitude and posture and understanding of the relative positions of the parties in this conversation it was designed to produce, none of it had reached them. None of it applied to them. They had never been given any reason to know Caesar. Picture the Roman envoys carrying that response back. Picture Petronius reading it. Picture the report eventually making its way north to Rome, and then further still, across the Mediterranean to wherever Augustus Caesar happened to be when it arrived. And the emperor of the known world reading that somewhere in Africa there existed a kingdom whose queen had buried his portrait beneath her temple steps, and whose warriors had looked his name in the face and felt precisely nothing. The humor in it is dark and quiet and 2,000 years old. And it is still, even now, completely and devastatingly perfect. And Amanirenas has been unable to drive the Romans entirely out of the territories they have occupied in the north. Their garrisons, fortified with Roman engineering thoroughness and supplied with Roman logistical efficiency, have proven resistant to the kind of sustained pressure that her resources, stretched thin by years of continuous warfare, are able to apply to them. Both sides are tired. Both sides have paid a price that, in the cold, honest arithmetic of military calculation, is straining the patience and the resources of the powers directing the conflict. And it is precisely at this moment of mutual exhaustion and military stalemate, when the situation is perfectly poised between the possibility of continued devastating conflict and the possibility of something entirely different, that Amanirenas makes the move that will define her legacy for the next 2,000 years. She sends a message to Augustus Caesar. Not a diplomatic communication filtered through layers of intermediaries and formal language and the careful, cautious hedging of political courtesy that ancient diplomacy generally preferred. Not a request, not a petition. She sends it directly, and she sends it clearly, and she sends it in terms so precisely, so perfectly constructed in their combination of apparent simplicity and devastating implication that the most experienced diplomatic minds of the ancient Mediterranean world would have recognized immediately what they were looking at. She sends golden arrows, a bundle of them, real ones, beautifully and deliberately crafted, gleaming in the African sunlight with the particular warm luster of Kushite goldwork, the finest in the ancient world, wrapped together with care and carried to the most powerful man alive by Kushite envoys who bore themselves with the quiet dignity of people representing a civilization that has absolutely nothing to apologize for and absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. And with the golden arrows she sends a message so completely and so almost unbearably perfect in its construction that the Greek historian Strabo recorded it in his Geography of the Ancient World, and it has been quoted with a mixture of admiration and disbelief ever since. The message said, "And take a moment here, in the stillness of this night, to let its full dimensions reach you. If you want peace, these golden arrows are a gift of warmth and friendship. If you want war, keep them, because you are going to need them." And the golden arrows catch the morning light as they are unwrapped, gleaming softly in the Aegean sunlight with the warm, rich luster of Kushite goldwork, each one crafted with the skill and the precision of an artisan tradition that had been producing objects of extraordinary quality for centuries. They are beautiful, made with the kind of intentional excellence that communicates in the universal language of craftsmanship, that the people who made them are people who take what they do seriously and do it very, very well. Augustus holds them, turns them in his hands, feels their weight and their balance and the particular quality of their making, and then the message is read to him. He listens. With the same controlled, expressionless, utterly unreadable attention that he brings to everything. Peace or war, warmth and friendship, or keep the arrows because you will need them. The most powerful man in the known world sits with those golden arrows in his hands and thinks. And what he thinks, turning the situation over in that remarkable mind with the patient, unsentimental thoroughness that has always been his greatest and most defining quality, is something that takes genuine intelligence and genuine honesty to arrive at. Because the honest assessment of the situation, laid out with the clear-eyed pragmatism that Augustus Caesar had always brought to the most difficult calculations of his career, is not flattering to Rome. The war with Kush has been costly. The campaign that was supposed to demonstrate Roman supremacy and Roman permanence on the southern border of Egypt has instead demonstrated something considerably more complicated and considerably less useful to the imperial narrative, that there exists in the desert south of the first cataract of the Nile a queen and a kingdom that cannot be broken. They have absorbed everything Rome has sent against them, and are still standing, and are still fighting, and are apparently, on the evidence of the golden arrows sitting in the emperor's hands, still completely and utterly certain of their own position. He thinks. And the calculation, honest and cold and completely stripped of the imperial pride that a lesser mind would have allowed to distort it, produces a conclusion that is as clear as it is extraordinary. The war is not worth continuing. The Queen is not going to stop. And the golden arrows are the most elegant invitation to a different resolution that anyone has ever placed before him. Augustus Caesar sets the arrows down, and he chooses peace. The envoys she sent to Samos were people of stature, people who carried themselves with the quiet, settled confidence of representatives of a civilization that has absolutely nothing to prove and absolutely nothing to apologize for, and is here not because it has been forced to come, but because it has chosen to, because its queen has decided that peace, on the right terms, serves her people better than the continuation of a war that has already cost them more than enough. Picture the Kushite envoys making their way through the marble-paved streets of a prosperous Greek island town toward the residence of the most powerful man in the world. Tall and dark and magnificently presented in the distinctive garments and the extraordinary gold jewelry of their ancient civilization, completely self-possessed grace of people who know exactly who they are and exactly what they represent. The Romans, watching them arrive, would have seen something that did not fit neatly into any of the categories their experience of empire had given them for understanding the people who came before their emperor seeking accommodation. They were not supplicants. They were not defeated. Enemies came to negotiate the terms of their surrender. They were diplomats, ambassadors, representatives of a civilization that had been building pyramids and smelting iron and trading across 3 continents since before Rome was a collection of mud huts on the banks of the Tiber. And they had come not to ask for anything that they had not already earned the right to receive, but to collect it. on behalf of a queen who had paid for it in the most direct and unambiguous currency available to any human being in any era of history: in blood, in grief, in the absolute, inexhaustible refusal to stop. The Kushite envoys spoke first. They said that their kingdom was sovereign, that it had been building its civilization and governing its people and defending its borders according to its own ancient laws and traditions for thousands of years before the first Roman soldier ever set foot in Egypt, and that nothing that had happened in the years since Rome arrived on Kush's northern border had changed any of those fundamental facts. They named what Rome had done, clearly and specifically, and without the diplomatic softening that might have made the accounting more comfortable for the people on the receiving end of it. The taxation imposed on Kushite communities in the border regions, communities that had never agreed to pay Roman taxes and had no obligation to do so. The monument erected at Philae, that breathtaking act of territorial claim and cultural condescension that had announced Rome's arrival in the borderlands with all the subtlety of a declaration of war. The military provocations that had preceded the campaign of 25 BC and that had left the kingdom of Kush with no reasonable alternative to the response it had made. And then they placed before the Roman negotiators the terms under which their queen was prepared to conclude the conflict and establish a lasting peace between the two civilizations. No taxation, no tribute, no Roman military presence on Kushite soil. These were not opening positions in a negotiation designed to arrive through compromise at something acceptable to both sides. These were the terms, and the Kushite envoys delivered them with the quiet, settled certainty of people who understood that their queen had already demonstrated on the battlefield that she was prepared to accept any alternative to these terms except one: surrender. And surrender for Amanirenas of Kush had never been an available option. The Treaty of Samos was concluded in the year 21 BC, and its terms, accepted in their entirety, were recorded and sealed and witnessed with the full legal and diplomatic weight of Roman imperial authority. No taxation of the Kushite kingdom. When Rome agreed not to tax Kush, it was agreeing that Kush was outside that sphere, beyond that reach, sovereign in a way that virtually nothing else in the ancient African and Mediterranean landscape was sovereign in relation to Rome. It was an acknowledgement written into the formal language of an imperial treaty that the kingdom of Kush was not Rome's to tax, not Rome's to regulate, not Rome's in any sense that mattered. In the ancient world, tribute was the payment that a lesser power made to a greater one in explicit acknowledgement of the hierarchy between them. Empires demanded tribute. Conquered peoples paid it. The payment of tribute was the clearest possible statement in the diplomatic language of the ancient world of who was above and who was below in the international order of things. For Rome to agree to demand no tribute from Kush was to agree that Kush was not below Rome, that it was not a lesser power, that it was not a conquered people, that it was, in the most direct and unambiguous terms available to ancient diplomacy, an equal, a sovereign nation, a free people. And the Roman military presence in the borderlands between Egypt and Kush was to be withdrawn to a mutually agreed boundary that respected Kushite territorial sovereignty completely. The soldiers who had marched south with Petronius and established their garrisons in the Nubian landscape with the confident permanence of an empire that expected to stay were going home. The border was being redrawn in Kush's favor, and the kingdom of Kush, that ancient gold-rich pyramid building, warrior queen producing civilization sitting in the heart of northeastern Africa, was being recognized formally and permanently, and in terms that carried the full weight of Roman imperial authority as exactly what it had always been: free, sovereign, answerable to no one, belonging entirely and completely and forever to itself. In the years following the Treaty of Samos, in those extraordinary, well-earned, deeply necessary years of peace and rebuilding that followed the conclusion of the war, Amanirenas turned the full force of her extraordinary energy and intelligence toward the project of giving her victory a permanent physical form. She commissioned temples, those magnificent, deeply purposeful buildings that served the Kushite world simultaneously as places of worship and centers of political authority, and repositories of cultural memory and declarations of civilizational permanence, that the people who built them were here, that they mattered, that what they had done was real and significant and worthy of the most careful and the most beautiful and the most permanent expression that their considerable artistic and architectural traditions could produce. The bronze head of Augustus Caesar, that exquisitely crafted portrait of the Roman emperor that her warriors had carried south from the captured border cities nearly 4 years earlier, that had been kept with deliberate care through all the campaigns and the reversals and the grinding years of the war's middle period, was to be placed beneath the threshold of the temple, beneath the steps, in the precise location where every person who entered that sacred space, every priest and every worshipper and every warrior and every ordinary citizen of Meroe going about the quiet business of their daily spiritual life would walk across it without knowing it was there. It was the statement of a woman who had won. She died in the year 10 BC, after a reign of approximately 30 years. She was approximately 50 years old. Not old by our modern understanding of a life's natural span, but in the ancient world of the 1st century BC, 50 years was a life fully. And when the end came, in the warm Nubian air of Meroe, in the kingdom she had spent her life protecting, surrounded by the pyramids of her ancestors and the sound of the Nile and the distant glow of the iron furnaces burning through the African night, it came to a woman who had finished her work. Her people gave her the burial that the Kandake tradition reserved for its greatest rulers. They built her a pyramid, narrow and steep and reaching upward from the Nubian desert floor with that particular Kushite urgency toward the vast blue sky. It stands today, or what remains of it stands today, battered by time and by the unfortunate activities of a 19th century treasure hunter who dynamited several Kushite pyramids in his search for gold and left behind him a landscape of deliberate damage that still breaks the hearts of archaeologists and historians who visit the site in the royal cemetery near the sacred mountain of Gebel Barkal, that ancient, holy, magnificent, flat-topped sandstone butte rising from the desert floor with the dramatic suddenness of a natural monument where the god Amun was believed by the Kushite people to live in the living rock of the mountain itself. And beside her pyramid, in the same sacred ground, stands the pyramid of Teritekas, her husband, the king who went north with her in the year 25 BC and did not come back. Separated in life by the random, indifferent violence of an ancient battle on the banks of a northern river. Together in death, in the desert they both loved. Beneath the sky they both knew, for as long as the stone above them held its shape against the slow erosion of the Nubian wind. And in 1910, after the world she inhabited had moved on and changed and forgotten her name with the casual thoroughness that history reserves for the people it has decided, for reasons that reflect its own limitations rather than theirs, not to remember. A British archaeologist named John Garstang was excavating the ruins of an ancient Kushite temple at Meroe, and his tools encountered something beneath the threshold of the building. Something solid and deliberate and carefully placed. He brushed away the sand and the centuries with the patient, focused attention of a man doing exactly what he was trained to do. And there, buried in the earth beneath the very spot where 2,000 years of worshippers had walked without knowing what lay beneath their feet, was the face of Augustus Caesar. The Meroe head, as it is now known in the catalogues and the exhibition notes of the British Museum in London, where it has resided since its discovery, and where it is displayed today in room 70 among the artifacts of other ancient civilizations, crafted with the sensitivity and the precision of a genuinely talented ancient sculptor working at the height of their abilities. Glass and stone eyes that give the face an almost living quality. The composed, authoritative expression of a man accustomed to absolute power. It is beautiful. It is historically priceless. That there was a queen, one-eyed, widowed, childless, and completely, utterly, magnificently undefeated, who looked the Roman Empire in the face and refused. Her name was Queen Amanirenas, and so here we are, at the end of a journey that began in the golden heart of ancient Africa and travelled through 30 years of war and grief and loss and triumph, and the quiet, steady being one of the most remarkable human beings who ever lived. She simply did what needed to be done. For her people, for her kingdom, for the freedom that she believed, with every fibre of her extraordinary being, was worth any price the world chose to ask for it. And in doing so, she left behind something that 2,000 years of silence could not extinguish. A story so completely, so timelessly human that it belongs not just to the kingdom of Kush, or to ancient Africa, or to the history of Rome, but to every single one of us who has ever lost something precious in the aftermath of that loss, to keep going anyway. This is Various Eras in Time. I want to thank you. What do you think of Queen Amanirenas? Leave your comments below, and we will see you in the next story.